In the shadow of the White House, just blocks from the seat of American power, a young man built a criminal empire so vast it would change Washington, D.C. forever. His name was Rayful Edmond III. At just 24 years old, he controlled over a third of the cocaine trade in the nation's capital, moving up to 1,700 pounds of pure Colombian cocaine every month. His story is one of ambition, excess, betrayal, and the crack epidemic that devastated an entire generation. To understand Rayful Edmond, you must first understand Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. While politicians debated policy in marble buildings, just miles away in neighborhoods like Trinidad and Logan Circle, a different kind of war was raging. The crack cocaine epidemic had arrived, and it hit D.C. harder than almost any other American city. Cheap, highly addictive, and incredibly profitable, crack transformed urban America into a war zone. Between 1985 and 1989, Washington, D.C. earned a grim distinction: murder capital of America. Bodies dropped in the streets daily. Entire neighborhoods became open-air drug markets. Children grew up dodging bullets on their way to school. And at the center of this chaos stood one man, a charismatic young dealer who seemed untouchable. Rayful Edmond III was born on November 26, 1964, in Washington, D.C. He wasn't born into poverty. His family was middle class, but they were also deeply connected to the drug trade. His mother, Constance, was known in the neighborhood. His father had ties to the underworld. From the very beginning, Rayful was surrounded by the game. Growing up in the Trinidad neighborhood of Northeast D.C., young Rayful was smart, charming, and ambitious. He attended Coolidge High School, where he was known for his flashy style and magnetic personality. But education wasn't his path. The streets called to him, and the money was too good to ignore. By his teenage years, Rayful was already dealing drugs. By his early 20s, he would be a kingpin. What set Rayful apart wasn't just his ambition, it was his connections. While other dealers fought over street corners, Rayful went straight to the source. He established direct relationships with the Medellín Cartel in Colombia, the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world at that time. This wasn't a middleman operation. Rayful was getting his cocaine directly from the Colombians, which meant higher purity, lower costs, and massive profits. The numbers were staggering. At the height of his operation in the late 1980s, Rayful's organization was moving between 1,000 and 1,700 pounds of cocaine into Washington, D.C. every single month. That's not street-level dealing. That's industrial-scale drug trafficking. His network generated an estimated $300 million in revenue. In today's money, that's over $700 million. And Rayful was barely old enough to rent a car. But Rayful wasn't just a businessman. He was a celebrity in the streets. He drove luxury cars, wore expensive jewelry, and courtside seats at Georgetown Hoyas basketball games were his regular spot. He knew athletes, entertainers, and politicians. He threw lavish parties where champagne flowed and money was no object. In a city ravaged by poverty and violence, Rayful lived like a king. His generosity was legendary. He gave money to people in the neighborhood, paid for funerals, helped families in need. To many residents of Trinidad, Rayful wasn't a criminal. He was a hero, a local boy who made it big and didn't forget where he came from. Kids wanted to be like him. Young dealers wanted to work for him. He represented the ultimate success story in a world where legitimate opportunities were scarce. But underneath the flash and glamour was a brutal reality. Rayful's empire was built on violence and addiction. The crack he flooded into D.C. destroyed families, killed users, and fueled a murder rate that made national headlines. Rival dealers who encroached on his territory were eliminated. Witnesses were intimidated. The code of the streets was enforced with bullets. Washington, D.C. became a war zone. In 1988 alone, there were 372 murders in the city. By 1991, that number climbed to 482, giving D.C. a murder rate higher than any major American city. Much of this violence was directly tied to the crack trade that Rayful dominated. Turf wars, drug debts, and power struggles turned neighborhoods into killing fields. And while Rayful sat courtside at basketball games, body bags were being zipped up just blocks away. Law enforcement knew about Rayful Edmond. The FBI, DEA, and D.C. police had been watching him for years, but building a case against him was incredibly difficult. Rayful was careful. He used coded language on phones. He operated through layers of insulation. And most importantly, nobody would testify against him. The code of silence in the streets was absolute. Snitches got stitches, or worse, they got killed. But every empire has cracks, and Rayful's began to show. In 1989, after years of investigation, federal prosecutors finally had enough evidence. On April 15, 1989, Rayful Edmond was arrested along with dozens of his associates in a massive, coordinated raid. The charges were overwhelming: running a continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy to distribute cocaine, and multiple counts of drug trafficking. The trial was a media sensation. Courtroom 10 in the federal courthouse became the stage for one of the most significant drug trials in D.C. history. Prosecutors presented wiretaps, surveillance footage, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. They painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal organization that had poisoned an entire city. The evidence was damning. Rayful's defense tried to portray him as a young man caught up in circumstances beyond his control, a product of his environment who was being scapegoated by a government desperate for a conviction. But the facts were undeniable. The wiretaps were clear. The financial records were devastating. Former associates, facing their own lengthy sentences, testified against him. On December 1, 1989, after a lengthy trial, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Family members wept. Rayful showed little emotion. He had gambled everything on beating the case, and he had lost. The sentencing came swiftly. Federal Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson handed down the maximum sentence allowed by law: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rayful Edmond was 24 years old. He would never walk free again. Judge Jackson's words were harsh and unforgiving. He described Rayful as a blight on the city, a man whose greed and ambition had caused immeasurable suffering. But the story didn't end there. Even behind bars, Rayful couldn't let go of the game. In one of the most audacious moves in federal prison history, Rayful continued to run drug operations from inside prison. Using smuggled cell phones and corrupt guards, he coordinated cocaine deals worth millions of dollars. He was trafficking drugs from a maximum security prison. When authorities discovered this ongoing operation in 1996, they were stunned. How brazen could one man be? Rayful was already serving life without parole. He had nothing to lose. But the discovery of his prison drug ring changed everything. Federal prosecutors came to Rayful with a proposition: cooperate, provide information on other major dealers, and we'll reduce your sentence. Rayful Edmond made a choice that would have been unthinkable in his younger years. He became an informant. The king of D.C. streets, the man who had built his reputation on the code of silence, began cooperating with the government. His testimony helped convict numerous other major drug traffickers. In exchange, his life sentence was reduced to 20 years. This decision made Rayful one of the most hated men in the criminal underworld. He had broken the ultimate rule. He had snitched. Death threats poured in. His name became synonymous with betrayal. Former associates who had once revered him now wanted him dead. The man who had been a street legend became a cautionary tale about what happens when you break the code. In 2024, after serving 35 years in federal custody, Rayful Edmond was released to a halfway house. He's now 60 years old, a ghost of the flashy young kingpin who once ruled Washington, D.C. The city he left behind has changed dramatically. The crack epidemic has faded. Neighborhoods have gentrified. New generations have risen who barely remember his name. But the impact of Rayful Edmond's empire remains. the lives destroyed by addiction, the families torn apart by violence, the children who grew up without fathers because of the drug war he fueled. The statistics are stark. Thousands of people fell victim to the crack epidemic in D.C., and Rayful's organization was at the center of it. Some still defend him, claiming he was a product of systemic poverty and racism, a young black man who took the only path to success available to him in a society that offered few opportunities. Others see him as a purely destructive force, a man whose greed and ambition caused immeasurable suffering for short-term gain. The truth, as always, is complicated. Rayful Edmond was both victim and victimizer. A young man raised in an environment where drug dealing was normalized, yet also someone who made conscious choices to build an empire on human misery. He showed kindness to his community while simultaneously poisoning it. He was beloved and feared in equal measure. What cannot be disputed is the scale of his operation and the lasting impact he had on Washington, D.C. For a brief moment in the late 1980s, a 20-something-year-old controlled one of the most significant drug distribution networks in America. He sat courtside at basketball games while his product destroyed lives. He lived like a celebrity while bodies dropped in the streets. Rayful Edmond's story is a cautionary tale about the seductive nature of drug money, the devastating impact of the crack epidemic, and the thin line between neighborhood hero and destructive criminal. It's a story about ambition without conscience, loyalty without honor, and the price of chasing the American dream through illegal means. Today, as Rayful Edmond lives out his final years in federal custody, Washington, D.C. continues to grapple with his legacy. The neighborhoods he once controlled have changed, but the scars remain. The crack epidemic may have faded, but new drugs and new dealers have taken its place. The cycle continues. Rayful Edmond was the king of cocaine in Washington, D.C. He built an empire, lived like royalty, and fell like Icarus. His story remains one of the most compelling chapters in the history of the American drug war, a reminder of how one man's ambition can change an entire city and how quickly a king can become a prisoner. Rayful Edmond III was released to a halfway house in 2024 after serving 35 years. His full release date has not been publicly disclosed. He remains one of the most controversial figures in D.C. history.